This is part two of a two-part series where we're walking through the configuration of Instana to monitor data power, infrastructure, and transaction tracking through the appliances. Part two will focus on tracing transactions. Let's do a quick overview. First, it's important to know that there's something called the API Gateway that is part of API Connect. Essentially, it's a subset of the DataPower appliance in terms of capabilities. The API Gateway is included in DataPower. So either way, it is supported and we can monitor the API Gateway and we can monitor the transactions through that API Gateway. When it comes to DataPower, there's three different form factors. There's the cloud-native OpenShift-based Cloud Pak for integration. There are physical servers and there are virtual appliances. The physical servers, virtual appliances, the configuration will be identical. For the cloud-native, there are small differences and we'll walk through those. Now, it's important to understand that API Connect has other capabilities besides the API Gateway, and those are well documented within the Instana docs. This particular video is not going to cover those. We're going to show you how to configure tracing through DataPower, but before we do, let's show you it in action. When looking at tracing, we're going to start with the applications. Here you see a list of the applications. I can select one, and I can see on the screen the golden signals. I'm going to drill into the dependencies. Here you see a topology of the application and the services that are calling each other. In this case, this is my DataPower appliance, and you can see the number of calls, erroneous calls, and latency going through DataPower. I can click on it and drill into various dashboards, including this filtered view of just the DataPower transactions. I can do things like analyze the calls, where I can see the types of calls as well as the individual transactions that are going through DataPower. I can select one of them and analyze what happened. Here's a slower transaction. And if I scroll down to the call stack, you can see the full set of transaction calls that took place as well as the timings. Here you can see, for example, a SQL query, and you get details of what happened for that query, the SQL statement over here on the right-hand side, and you see lots of context around DataPower. Transaction tracking or tracing of DataPower and the API Gateway started to get introduced in version 10.6. The recommendation is to get to a level of 10.6.0.6 or above. As of August 25th, the following capabilities are there. For the multi-protocol gateway, we can trace the transactions for the transaction types seen on the slide. You can also do tracing through the web service proxy. You can do tracing through the API Gateway. One thing to note is that if you're using your API Gateway in v5c compatibility mode, that's not supported. There is documentation here. You can see links on doing tracing through DataPower, and you can see also below tracing through the API Gateway. One important configuration piece is that if you're using HTTP, you need to set the content type to binary. Look at the links here, but we're going to show you a demonstration of this and how to configure it. Before you can start sending data into an Instana agent, you need to make sure that it's configured and listening for OpenTelemetry data. On a traditional server, within the configuration YAML file, you should see a section like this, so you need to make sure that that's enabled to true. If it is and you do a netstat command, you should see it listening on ports 4317 and 4318. In a Kubernetes environment, what you can do is you can look for the Instana service using an OC or kubectl command and see that the service is listening on those ports. And when you configure your connection to the agent within the OpenTelemetry config within DataPower, you need to either specify the IP address of the service or specify the service name, instana-agent.instana-agent. Let's walk through the configuration of tracing within DataPower. First, you have to select the domain. Then you're going to select the component you want to configure. In this case, I've got multiple gateways. I'm going to select one of them. Over here, you can see there's a tab for OpenTelemetry. Now, I've got one selected already, but the general process would be that you would create an instance, give it a name, add comments if you want, and you have to define an exporter. So I'm going to add a new exporter. You're going to give that a name as well. You'll notice the administrative state is turned on. And then within the exporter, you get to pick a few things. So here would be the host that's going to receive the OpenTelemetry data. So generally speaking, we recommend sending that data to an agent, but you can send it directly to the Instana server. You pick the port. Now the port's going to depend on what protocol you pick. So for HTTP, the default port is 4318. For gRPC, it's 4317. And the rest of the information for gRPC is fine. The defaults will work as is. For HTTP, you have to make one other change. So now change this back to 4318. And at the very bottom, what you're going to see is there's a field for the content type. You must select binary, otherwise this won't work. Then you save your changes by applying. You've now applied the changes to save the exporter. And now you can save the changes to the multi-protocol gateway. And I'm done. If you want to send data directly to the Instana server, the configuration will look like this. You'll see the URL will be something like OTLP-HTTP and the base domain for your server, or OTLP-gRPC. I'm going to use HTTP in this case. The port is 443. You need to set up a TLS client. I'm going to show you what the configuration looks like. In this case, it's just the cipher that we're going to use for this particular configuration. In addition, you need to add a header. So you can see the header that I've added here. This is the Instana agent key. This is the agent key for your Instana server. That's what's going to allow the Instana server to allow the connection from this particular multi-protocol gateway. As you saw before, you need to set it to binary. If you want to check to see if OpenTelemetry is working or to debug it, what you can do is come to search for OpenTelemetry, and you'll see the exporter status. Here, you can see how many were successful, how many requests failed, and if you refresh this, you'll see that the numbers are changing. So quickly, you can see that this particular gateway is having problems. This other one seems to be working fine. If you then need to debug further, what you can do is you can do a search again and look for the system log. And within the system log, you'll see messages like this, that the OpenTelemetry exporter failed. The process for a cloud-native environment is similar. You'll see multi-protocol gateway, web service proxy. You'll click on them. If you're looking for the API gateway, what you would do is you would search, and then you can go in and configure in a very similar manner. You're going to see the OpenTelemetry tab. The only thing that's a little bit different is when you're dealing with a standalone API gateway. When dealing with a standalone API gateway, Chris Phillips has created a blog that documents and supplements what's in the product documentation. You can go to this URL and you can find detailed information on walking through that configuration.